This lesson is about Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah that we discussed in the last lesson. And right away in chapter 25, it states that after Sarah's death, Abraham took another wife named Keturah, who bore more children. These would be seen as legitimate by the culture since they were by his legal wife and not a servant or concubine. But even so, they still aren't in the line of promise through Sarah's son Isaac. But God did include in the promise the fact that he would be the father of many nations, not just one. So the blessing does extend as far as the part about many nations, but there's a particular line with special promises that only come from Sarah. Now there's some notable names here in this passage that include names like Sheba and Dedan. You can see that in verse 3. There are two sets of these names, one descending from Ham and the other from Abraham and Keturah, who, according to Josephus, settled in the Arabian Peninsula. Some say that the Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon, was from sub-Saharan Africa, but Sheba was in the area of modern Yemen, which is the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. And there's a link in the description. You can read more about that if you want. And it includes a lot more insight into modern political alliances with the Saudis because of this, alliances between them and the U.S. and UK. And that's, of course, significant in Bible prophecy. So if you want to pursue that, it would be a good idea because you'll have a better handle on what's going on in the world today regarding Bible prophecy and the Middle East. So now verse 5 says that Abraham gave his entire estate only to Isaac, not to any of the other children, including, those of Keturah, his legal wife. Even so, he did give some gifts to them before sending them off to eastern lands, because you can't have all those people in one place and support them. So then Abraham died, and we see the phrase gathered to his people there in verse 8. We should be careful not to read too much into ancient statements of the afterlife, even from the Old Testament, which doesn't give a lot of detail about it. They certainly understood that their souls would rise at a final judgment, since even Job, we'll study another time, knew about this and lived around the same time, according to most historians, that he was somewhere in the age of the patriarchs. So they did believe in an afterlife. They felt that everyone went down to the grave in some way when their bodies died, and that their souls went to a good place or a bad place, and that later there would be, at the end of time, a judgment when everyone was raised and their lives would be assessed by God. So then God blesses Isaac, who certainly knew firsthand about God, seeing that God stopped him from being sacrificed when he was a young man. So he absolutely had firsthand experience with God. But just the text first turns to chronicle the line of Ishmael, who, according to God's promise to Abraham, also allowed Ishmael to have 12 leaders come from him. We will see that there will be 12 coming from Jacob eventually, but though the Septuagint, the Greek here, merely says that his descendants lived in the presence of his relatives, that's down here in verse 18, the Masoretic text says that they lived in hostility toward them, which is right. Well, we can remember the prediction that God gave about Ishmael being a wild and antagonistic man, so that would seem to make sense, that he wasn't just living near them, he was living in hostility to them. But it's not a really crucial detail either way. Then in verse 19, it begins the lineage of Isaac, or the account of Isaac, and his wife was barren just as his mother had been. But he prayed for her, and she became pregnant with twin boys, who literally fought each other before they were born. It got so unbearable for Rebekah that she asked God why this was happening, and God replied with something every Bible student should know in order to fathom the endless feud between Arabs and Jews. So we'll skip down there to that verse. And God's reply is that two nations were within her, one stronger than the other, and that the first one born would serve the younger one. The first one was called Esau because he was covered in red hair, so that's what's the meaning of his name. And the second was called Jacob because he was grasping his brother's heel. That's literally what his name means, to grasp the heel. Esau grew up to be a skilled hunter, while Jacob was a quiet man who preferred to stay home. Another example of how God does not define a real man, quote unquote, the same way people do. As God will point out much later when choosing a replacement for the first king of Israel that they demanded, he looks on a person's heart, not their flesh. And some people would say that because he wanted to stay home and not go out and be a manly hunter, there was something wrong with him, but God obviously thought otherwise. Now, verse 28 is probably the first recorded example of parenting blunders 101. Each parent had their favorite child. The father preferred the rugged outdoorsman, and the mother preferred the thoughtful indoor man. This set the stage for what is arguably the most pivotal family rift in history. That isn't all that would cause it, but that's the beginning of it. So Esau comes home, it says, from hunting, and he's famished, and there was homebody Jacob in the kitchen with a freshly made pot of red stew. So here's the red again. Esau is known for his red hair, and Jacob is making a red stew. So this earned Esau the nickname Edom, which mainly means to boil, the boiling stew, which was also used figuratively for someone who is arrogant or aggressive. But it's also very similar to a word meaning red, which is why it also sounds very much like the name Adam, Edom, Adam, for the red dirt that Adam was made from. So the stew being red as well makes this nickname for the red-haired man rich with meaning. Edom would also become a tribal name, sometimes in the form of Idumean, which we would encounter again in the New Testament regarding the trials of Jesus. So keep that in mind. But Jacob, of course, seizes this opportunity of his famished brother to make a trade for something with priceless quality that Esau despised, his birthright as the firstborn son. So the chapter ends by pointing out that Esau really can't blame anyone but himself for this, though later he will try. So because Esau handed it over willingly, he didn't have to make this deal, but he said, what good does a birthright when I'm starving? So as if he couldn't get food anywhere else. I'm not sure what he was thinking, but there was the food and there he was, and he didn't think about anything but the moment. So it really is his fault. And this isn't an act of trickery, it's just deal making that Esau unwisely agreed to. So now let's go to chapter 26. And it says that because of a famine that Isaac moved down to the land of the Philistines. Remember who they are from our previous lesson. But God told him to stay there and not continue on to Egypt, and he repeated the blessing he had given to Abraham. Now, since God had directly spoken to him, you would think that would assure him that he and his family would be safe. But you'd be wrong, because, as we're going to see, let me skip down to there. This is reiterating the promise, and we have to remember that regardless of these people's faults, that God made a promise and he will keep it regardless, and that's a lot of the reason they still got their blessings. So, the reason you'd be wrong about him not worrying about his safety is because Isaac decides to carry on the family business, so to speak, since he, like his father, has a beautiful wife. He thinks the men of the land might kill him to get her, so to save his own skin, he passes her off as his sister. Lather, rinse, repeat. Even God must be face-palming by now. But again, he will leave there with great wealth because of this, so go figure. But the difference here is that they had been in the land for a long time before anyone finds out the truth, though somehow no man had touched her. So another difference, if you go on to read here, is that in this case, the king didn't give him his wealth. God did, by blessing his crops and herds. So again, go figure. But again, remember that God made promises to Abraham and they will be carried out. But this blessing came with a cost also. The Philistines became envious and tried to hurt him by plugging up all the wells his father Abraham had dug in the area. So he moved away by the king's request, but he also reopened the wells. Then he discovered another well, and the locals claimed it was theirs, so he moved on and dug another one with the same results. So he's going around trying to get a well to support his people and his animals, but somebody keeps claiming it. So finally, he digs one that nobody claims, and he's able to settle there. But later, the king who had sent him away out of envy of the Philistines came to him and wanted to make an alliance, since it was clear that God was blessing him. This is mostly another case of saving one's skin. He sees that this person is a potential threat, so rather than trying to war against someone that God is obviously blessing, he decides to make a deal with them, an alliance. So you can read all the rest of that here in chapter 26, if I can just get my page to scroll. And they took an oath and all that. And it says also that Esau took a wife at the age of 40 and took two of them actually from among the people of the area. And these wives were a continual source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So these are basically Hittites or Canaanites in the general area. And now we'll see who else brings grief, at least to Isaac, because Esau already has lost his birthright to his younger brother, but now he'll lose even more. So let's go on to chapter 27. And Isaac realized that his end is near, so he calls for his favorite outdoorsman and asks him to go hunting and bring him venison to eat, after which he'll give him the final blessing. But Rebekah was eavesdropping, so she hatches this plan to make sure her favorite son gets the blessing instead. She makes a meal to taste like the venison Isaac loves, and then dresses up Jacob in animal skins to mimic Esau's hairy arms and wild game smell, since Isaac had become blind. So we'll skip down there to that, where she lays out the details of that plan. And so Jacob goes to Isaac with the food, and when Isaac says, "How did you get back here so fast?" Jacob comes up with this clever excuse that it was a miracle. So let me skip down to that so you can see that. There's that in verse 20. But the voice made Isaac suspicious. He couldn't mimic his voice very well, evidently. So Isaac tells him to come closer. So he still identifies the voice as Jacob's, but the touch and smell convince him it's Esau. But he asks again, "Is this really Esau?" And again, Jacob lies right through his teeth. And this is the primary inheritor of the blessing. Because God makes promises and he chooses certain people for certain reasons, it is not a blanket endorsement of everything they do. So finally, Isaac goes ahead and gives the blessing, but no sooner than Jacob leaves the room, in comes his brother Esau with the meal his father had asked for. And when they both realize what happened, let me skip down to that before I comment on it. When they find out what happened, Esau becomes hysterical and reminded Isaac that Jacob, the literal heel grabber, was also the figurative deceiver. That's what the phrase came to mean. Someone who grasps the heel is someone who is deceptive and conniving. So now he piles on the past incident of losing his birthright and cries some more, but then he still manages to get what you could call a mixed blessing from Isaac. He will be a fighter who nonetheless serves his brother, but in the end he will be free of him. So you can read all of that in this section. And Esau lives with this death wish then on Jacob, but he bides his time until Isaac dies. But again, Rebekah finds out about it, so she sends off Jacob to her brother Laban, a name you might recall from an earlier lesson, but she needs a cover story, so she tells Isaac that she's sending Jacob away to get a wife from elsewhere because the Hittite women are despicable, which is technically true, but it's still a cover story. So that's how that chapter ends, and let's go on to a little bit of chapter 28, and we'll just do part of that because it's kind of a better stopping point before the next lesson. So we're going to do the first 10 verses here, and we can see that in spite of everything, Isaac sends off Jacob with his blessing. So there it is in verse 3. Esau sees sees this blessing being given, so he knows where Jacob's going. But he also sees that both his parents despise the local women, so even though he already has two wives from the area, he goes to his father's brother Ishmael, just as Jacob was going to his mother's brother Laban. Esau goes to his father's brother Ishmael to get another wife, just to make them happy, I suppose. And you can check the link in the description for a discussion of the names and numbers of Esau's wives, because there's differences between this passage and the genealogy that will come later in Genesis 36. And that article will point out that when it comes to genealogies, not everyone is mentioned, and sometimes names are, people have more than one name. And so they go over all the details of that. So if you really want to know, if there's any question that comes up about, wait, which text is right, and in this case, I don't think there's a discrepancy between the Greek and the Masoretic Hebrew text. It's more a matter of the two passages, but we have to remember how the Bible handles genealogies, and that this is more concerned with bloodlines and generations than naming everybody. So we're going to stop here. Verse 10 is where it says that Jacob actually finally leaves and goes off into Haran, which the more familiar name is in Hebrew over here on the right. And we'll stop there, because next time we'll read about the famous incident of Jacob's ladder and his dealings with treacherous Laban over wanting to marry one of his daughters. So he's going there to marry a daughter, but it's not going to be, again, not rainbows and lollipops. Things will get even still more complicated and more drama and more, trying to keep track of who married who and all the problems it causes every time they try to fix things. So that will be in the next lesson, and we'll stop there and pick that up next time.